Tēnā koutou katoa. Ko Richard Watman taku noa. I'm your MC for this morning to talk about the Drinking Water Regulation Report. It's a technical webinar. I'm the least interesting person from Tamata Arawai here today. And with me, as you will see, joined by three people who know a lot more about this webinar than I do. Noah Hensley, India Iolat, and Ryan O'Shea. And they have all been intimately involved in the preparation of the Drinking Water Regulation Report, its data, and the analysis of it. So let me begin with a whakatauki. Ko te wai aho, ko aho te wai. He whakatauranga tātou no te wai, ko te ora te wai, ko te ora o te tangata. He taonga te wai me te aki, ko wai tātou, ko wai tātou. So I'm going to introduce the meat of the discussion today, and then part one, which is drinking water safety, will be spoken to by Noah. Part two, drinking water supplier performance, by Ryan, and source water is over to India. The webinar will be recorded. It will be available on TNA's Tamata Arawai's website in the event section, but there'll be a quick link on the homepage so you can easily get to it afterwards. Please put any questions you have in the chat, and then we will be able to respond to them at the end. Now, this is a 40-slide long presentation, which is monster, so we're going to race through it, and only pausing where there's something really significant to say. So please, as you go, put your questions in the chat so that we get a chance to review them and we can maximize the amount of time that we have to answer those questions at the end. Okay, so who are we dealing with? Mostly council supplies in terms of the number of people covered, but there's still a large number of community and private suppliers and government suppliers who have registered and are verified, and they form part of our analysis. What's not covered are unregistered, unverified supplies and domestic self-supplies. Slide. So I'm sure by now many of you are familiar with this kind of infographic that we have. So 84% of the population is covered by verified registered supplies, 16% out there on their own in one way or another. And of the population, 4.4 million are in the registered verified category. The vast majority of people are covered by council supplies, although they're not the majority of supplies covered. So all but 200,000 are covered by councils. In terms of annual renewals, well done, councils. 97% have renewed this year. That's great. 39% of government supplies, and largely that's explained by the particular issues that the Ministry of Education has, and we've been in discussions and continue with how all of that's going to be resolved, and there is work in train to get it solved. And actually I'm quite surprised at the 75% of community and private suppliers that have renewed, because many of them face similar issues to the Ministry of Education. So well done, private and community, although obviously we'd like the numbers to go up. So what we're going to cover are the following data sources: registration information, drinking water safety plans, consumer advisories, notifications, reporting on the drinking water quality assurance rules, and general and residual disinfection exemptions. So that's me, and now you'll get to the interesting people.
Oh no, I think you might be on mute.
I am on mute. Apologies for that. Tina Koto Katoa, Ko Noa Toku Ingoa. I'm the senior technical advisor at Taumata ROI, and I just want to talk to you about the drinking water safety section. So in general, this section of the DWRR is about having a drinking water safety plan. So whether you've lodged it with us or not, it talks about consumer advisories, which are directly related to the safety of drinking water, as well as notifications, which notifications are also directly linked to the safety of drinking water here in Aotearoa. So first thing I want to just highlight is we're very much focused on a multi-barrier approach at the moment. And so this comes straight from the legislation, and hopefully you're all very, very aware of what a multi-barrier approach consists of. So furthermore, the drinking water quality assurance rules and acceptable solutions set those minimum requirements for barriers to be effective. So we do expect you to be complying with all of that. All of those requirements. There will be additional measures that you'll need to put in place for those barriers to be effective. For instance, we don't tell you that you need critical control points, but those are quite a good thing to implement to make sure that you do comply at all times. We expect compliance with all the rules. However, we haven't really linked the rules directly to drinking water safety in this instance. In the future, you can expect us to potentially link treatment performance to safety in the future. So we consider that these barriers must be in place and effective to ensure a multi-barrier approach is implemented. And those minimum requirements of the rules are kind of that minimum effectiveness criteria that you need to meet. Just as a reminder, there are multiple compliance pathways for suppliers. There are general exemptions, which we actually recently published a general exemption for DOC, covering about half of their current supplies, but also they have over 600 unregistered supplies that may be covered in that exemption once they register. So that's quite a significant kind of coverage that we needed to get across with DOC. So we're really pleased with where we've landed there. We're also set up to deliver according to the scale, risk, complexity, and risk of supplies out there. This is not a one-size-fits-all approach. We've demonstrated that through granting exemptions, through the adoption of acceptable solutions, by which we actually have had private and community supplies tick our box for acceptable solution. It's a pretty good uptake, I think. We hope that that will increase in the future, and we are looking at other options for acceptable solutions as well. The other pathways are basically everyone has to supply safe drinking water, meet the standards, and supply sufficient quantity. With the drinking water quality assurance rules, that's one pathway with safety plans, meeting aesthetic values, and backflow protection. So that's one pathway you can go down to, and you'd have to meet all those requirements, among others. And then there's acceptable solutions, which kind of covers you for all those requirements. So with the compliance pathways, drinking water safety plans, again, well done, councils. You've lodged your drinking water safety plans with us for the most part. There's a few still out there lingering at the beginning of 2023. And that is what this is saying. So you may have lodged those missing ones recently. We were surprised by the number of safety plans not lodged by Ministry of Education, but they do have a really unique circumstance in which they're a supplier with the most supplies out there, over 400 supplies. So more plans have been lodged than last year. Most of the population is covered by a drinking water safety plan, and that's really good news. Most small suppliers which have not lodged it. So most of the suppliers which have not lodged their plans are small supplies, as shown by the population and the kind of number of supplies here. Just a reminder, we do not approve plans, but we do expect them to be lodged with us and implemented. So we are reviewing plans and following up with monitoring and compliance actions that we deem necessary at the time. In terms of notifications, so this is all your data that you're giving to us, and we summarize it in this report. So there's been a significant increase in notifications, maybe or is unsafe water. And you can see from the graph that most of that increase is due to issues in the Clutha District Council supply regarding aluminium exceedances and other issues. We have worked with Clutha quite closely to ensure these issues are resolved, and we just want to acknowledge that they have made significant progress last year in resolving these issues. So the previous one was actually for maybe or is unsafe water, which is a separate notification, is a separate duty on you to notify us than whether water meets the standards. So in terms of the standards, I mean the MAVs. So this is just a breakdown of basically MAV exceedances that we've been notified by. So we had 335 supplier notifications of MAV exceedance. So that's from you guys. And then we had 604 laboratory exceedances notified from the labs. There is a reason that there's a gap here. And some of that reason is those high number of Clutha exceedances that we got for aluminium. And we actually allowed them to reduce their administrative burden. We allowed them to not have to notify us every time they had an exceedance. But we haven't made that allowance for everyone. So we'd certainly expect you, if you don't have our permission, you need to notify us. Essentially, it's under the Act. So lab notifications are a really important backstop for us, and I think this shows that because there actually have been quite a number of notifications where we didn't actually receive a supplier notification, and they didn't have permission for us to not notify us. So in terms of, we generally just contact them and see what the issue is. We try to get them to notify us. Sometimes they just don't have the technology requirements that they need or the capacity to do that. But in the end, we're really outcome focused. So our response to lab notifications has directly resulted in some consumer advisories and also, and more importantly, suppliers understanding their duty to supply safe water to their consumers. So we work with these suppliers so that we are focused on these outcomes of safe water every day for everyone. You probably are all seen this map if you read the report. And I'll probably just note that we expect suppliers to recognize any notification of E. coli as serious and requires an effective response and investigation. And the legislation is really clear on this. Just for comparison, England and Scotland have exceptionally low rates of E. coli detection. Scotland has a similar makeup to us. They have small water supplies, and they do have one big company managing most of that. And I think they had less than 10 E. coli notifications for their whole supply. UK had less than 10 in 2022. So and they have similar, if not more, testing, onerous testing requirements. So there's something going on here. There's probably a number of issues, which I won't go into at the moment. But yeah. Yeah, in this report, we did decide that transparency with chemical notifications and exceedances was important. Putting the median and the maximum out there was a bit of a call, but yeah. We don't go into the detail of each one of these notifications, and we don't omit notifications. We leave this as you are reporting to us or a lab is reporting to us that a chemical has been exceeded in drinking water. So the important thing is that you're investigating these issues, that you're notifying us when your lab tells us that you have exceeded the MAV in drinking water, and that you're following up and that you're making sure it doesn't happen again. So a common one is lead. It's really easy to detect lead in a sample from a dodgy tap. So you need to understand that that will be made public. And so you'll need to change your taps and get taps that are suitable for sampling for lead. Similar with the coli, it might be a sampling error. We're still going to put it in this report. So what you need to do is your best to work with the lab to minimize sampling error. And that's what England and Scotland have done. For consumer advisories, we broke these down by long-term and temporary. So long-term advisories are where they aren't necessarily 20 days or 30 days. There's no limit to that we've kind of declared. It's more about the situation and the reason. And so some of these might, a number of these have actually been associated with the general exemptions. So some of those are dock supplies. Others are rural supplies, and there's just a lot of work to be done to be able to install the appropriate treatment. In terms of temporary supplies, those are the, you've received an E. coli and there's been a short-term issue basically. So this is not great for us. And we definitely will be working, especially on those long-term supplies. And we hope the temporary boil water notices goes down as well as people meet those minimum requirements in the rules. So I'll hand over to Ryan now, who's going to present to us on supplier performance.
Thanks, Noah. Kia ora, everyone. My name is Ryan O'Shea. I'm a senior data analyst with Taumata Arawai, and worked very closely with our technical advisors, Noah and India in particular, to provide the data analysis for this report. So I'm going to walk you through the methodology that we used to analyze the rules data. And if you have any questions, just pop them in the chat. And if there's anything that we can't answer immediately, we can get back to you. Okay, so you probably already know that the rules are complex and there's a lot of them. Essentially what our goal was to be able to summarize the rules data up to categories that would make sense to people. And so what we've ended up doing is developing essentially a taxonomy of the rules so that we can go in and summarize sets of rules. And we've kind of taken a rules as data approach and developed a metadata table that allows us to pull out individual rules and group them into groupings and kind of analyze the data that way. All of this is in the appendix as well, but essentially we've focused on rules relating to sources or abstraction points, treatment plants, and distribution zones. And what we've essentially tried to do is to take each of those categories and group them into this classification structure. So 100% is all met, 95 to 99% is almost met, 1 to 94% is partially met, and 0% is none met. And if we didn't find any reports for that category, we would define them as no reports found. No valid reports also probably bears some explanation here. If, for instance, we found, if a supplier provided reports to us where there were some issues with data integrity or something that meant that we couldn't quite rely on that rule, that data was omitted. And if we couldn't find any valid rules to analyze, they were classed as no valid reports found for that category. In the report as well, we've focused on council supplies as they had the best and a really good reporting rate overall. You can also view essentially the individual rule IDs that we analyse for each of these categories in the appendix. Some certain rules, for instance, some treatment rules where there's actually a set of rule IDs relating to various parameters. Each individual rule ID is weighted equally, therefore that rule that it belongs to would feature more heavily if it's against multiple parameters. We also performed quite a bit of automated validation tests. So initially, and some of you may have some experience with this, when you're trying to submit a report, if it doesn't pass our initial tests, the API will reject it and you'll get a message back saying that the submission needs to be corrected. But we also did some post-submission validation checks. And some examples of that, for instance, if an invalid rule ID has been submitted, or if suppliers are submitting treatment plant rules against source rules, or if there's something to indicate, for instance, not too common mistake was appearing to report non-compliant days for rules that had a annual compliance period. So for instance, if you tried to calculate the compliance rate for that rule, you'd end up with like a negative zero compliance rate. In some cases as well, we also incorporated registration information against the rules. So for instance, some rules are specific to roof sources, for example. We used some of that data to also do some cross-validation against what had been reported. So this will walk you through a kind of the step-by-step. So we've focused on only reporting those rules which had actually been reported to us. We kind of took the approach of just trying to use all the data that we had and not making too many assumptions about if a rule had been missed. So we would just take all of the data that had been provided to us and group it up into these performance categories and calculate the compliance rate. So essentially, once it had passed through these steps, has it been reported correctly? So this is all the validation tests. If a rule failed that test, we wouldn't analyze it. And then we basically calculate a compliance rate for each rule component for the year, and assign it a value between 0 to 1, where 1 would equal 100% compliant. And then from there, we take that and essentially calculate the average over those rules for each supply component, and then average that again. So I'll walk you through this example here. So in this first step, and you can see some of the code that we used. So we've kind of developed a analytical pipeline so that we can reproduce all of the results in this report. So this example here, we're looking at the bacterial treatment rules, and you can see we've calculated over the year an overall compliance rate for each rule. Then we take the average of that, and that gives us a performance or compliance rate for that particular rule category and component, and then we take that and average that. So the average is kind of a average performance of the component against that rule set. Some of the challenges with this data as well. So it's complex data. Just to put it in perspective in terms of the rules reporting that we received, we had 110,000 or just over 110,000 rules submitted for 2023. So we had to simplify it, and some of the things that we found as we were going through the analysis challenged some of our assumptions. We avoided looking at whether or not a supply had reported against all of the rules that we would expect, because there's some rules that are conditional. So essentially we took the approach of just reporting what had been provided to us. We took all of the data that had been provided by 31st of March 2024 and fixed it at that. We didn't, we haven't verified any of the data that had been provided to us as an against ground truth. So we expect that suppliers are providing us that data. We didn't look at all the rules. For instance, we focused on a subset of rules that we expected most suppliers to report something against and use that to calculate the performance categories. In some cases, so for instance, if each component was weighted equally, so we don't necessarily know if, for instance, a plant is operating intermittently or producing less water. So that was something that we did. That was a simplification we made, is to weight the components equally. And I'll walk you through an example. So here, the Little River suppliers, they've T2 module applies to their treatment plant. They've only got one treatment plant, so it's a nice simple case. We have a set of treatment performance T2 and T1 treatment performance category that you can see. All the rules for that are in the appendix. And so it uses these rules here. And so they had 18 requirements. They were essentially 100% compliant against most of their rules, except they had 2 rules where they were non-compliant for 3 months out of 12. And so you can see it's just a simple average over that. And so for that particular treatment plant, they get a category of almost met, because the average compliance rate is 97.2%. Where the average gives you the overall compliance rate if the rules have been reported equally across the period. And here's another example. So Big River Supply, they've got 2 treatment plants. They're a T3 supplier, so their requirements are slightly more complex and they have to provide more reporting. They've used this rule set, and they were 11 rules which were compliant for 100% of the time, but then they had 1 rule which was compliant for 345 out of 365 days. And so again, using that equally weighted average, they have a compliance rate of 99.5%, so we would define them as almost met. So it's quite a high threshold. Now, we had council suppliers, mostly where we're getting the rules data from, so we focused on analysing them. We also had really good reporting from the Department of Corrections, but we just made the decision to only focus on council supplies here. So one of our focuses is to try and get reporting rates up for government supplies. And that said, we still had some areas where it appears that councils aren't reporting against all of their requirements. So for example, we had bacterial monitoring rules. We had 81% of council suppliers we would expect reports from. Bacterial treatment performance as well, 95%, so good response rate there. We didn't get as many reports against the protozoa log credit requirement rules, so we're aiming to get better reporting rates against that rule. Yeah, so that's going to be an area of focus for us, is just driving up general reporting rates and also understanding where suppliers aren't reporting, and looking to get the rates up. So here's an example of going through all of that and what we've actually reported in the report itself. So when you see that, generally we found that the larger suppliers were meeting their requirements where they'd reported. in this case, we had 40% of suppliers that didn't provide reporting here, but they only represent a very small proportion of the population. And that was a general kind of theme throughout the report. Some of the things that we'll be looking to implement is going forward is providing more upfront data validation. So so that you get feedback when you're submitting reports if something doesn't make sense or we're not able to use the data. We also want to be providing some sort of feedback loop as well so that you can actually see what you've reported to us. We'll be going into more detail with the protozoa rules and looking at some of the protozoa process rules, and then also looking to analyze completeness more, so getting better data and being able to be, that allows us to be more responsive in terms of which rules suppliers aren't reporting on. Yeah, okay. India, shall I hand it over to you?
Hi, thank you. Kia ora koutou, ko India Arawai aho. I am another senior technical advisor here at Taumata Arawai, and I will be presenting on the source water section. It is the last section, so do recall, add your questions to the chat, because after this, we'll be able to go through them. Can you go back a slide, please? So just to reiterate, the source water monitoring provided in this report was insightful on the drinking water sources around the country. Aside from what we get from this information does also support water suppliers to understand their raw water quality and therefore how to best treat it to make it safe for users. This source water monitoring can also support suppliers being represented in the consenting process in these catchments, because if there's a potentially harmful activity that is applying for consent, then that could influence these values. These samples can be considered by the consenting authority if that would be an acceptable activity to be taking place. So next slide, please. So the source water protection is the first barrier in a water supply, and it influences the quality of the water throughout the treatment and through to the consumers. So the Water Services Act has enabled suppliers that have a source water, so like not water carriers, for instance, they don't have this. So it enables them to focus more on this barrier with source water risk management plans, which is a part of the Drinking Water Safety Plan. And that can then inform the monitoring program to understand the water quality trends in that particular supply. In an ideal situation, a supplier would have significant control and ability to protect their source water from contamination. But if that's not available, then this monitoring is a small step towards that source water protection so that you can have some influence over what happens in the catchment to some extent, but mostly so you're aware of what's happening. Next slide, please. So all sources should have a form of monitoring. This can be done with grab samples or with continuous monitoring. The source water samples are reported to us annually, but they're meant to represent the supply as a whole. And so it's not only the elevated values, and these are meant to be collected throughout the year to inform the monitoring requirements of the supplier, as well as necessary risk management practices. So considering that, there were far fewer suppliers providing sample results than we expected. There was a particular slide earlier that mentioned that we had almost 500 suppliers reporting, but over 1,000 were required to. Here we only got source samples from just over 300 suppliers. Next slide, please. So while samples of source water may not be required to meet MAV for the drinking water standards, it is still indicative of the treatment requirements of that supply. And that goes for microbiological treatment as well, where E. coli monitoring plays a big part in understanding the bacterial and microbial contaminants in the source. So of the nearly 16,000 samples, the majority were from deep bores. However, that is likely due to the sampling requirements of those using an interim class 1 or class 1 bore, where E. coli and total coliform monitoring requirements are much higher. The range of values here show that all source types have a variable water quality. And to further emphasize that, on the next slide, I've also got the percentages of samples by source where E. coli was actually detected. So what's clear is that every source type is at risk of microbiological contamination to some extent. The deeper bores in general had a lower volume of sample detections, which can be skewed by the sheer volume of samples, but they did actually have lower in some cases. Regardless, the fact that the E. coli is being detected in these deep bores indicates, is reiterating that the depth of a bore is not a guarantee of water being free from microbiological contaminants, and it's really important to value and prioritize the protection of bore heads and the areas around bores to reduce the risk of contamination. Also, we've got here roof water had the highest proportion of E. coli detections of samples provided. This is a comparatively lower number of samples compared to other source types, but there were still far fewer samples with no E. coli detected in them, which, if you consider the exposure your roof has to bird droppings and other pests, it's not actually that surprising. Last slide is about some highlighted chemical determinants. Some determinants found in source water aren't actually easily treated or standard treated. It's easy to remove. So by testing for these, you can find out if you need to add specialized equipment to treat and remove it. Otherwise, the potential MAV exceedance could carry through to the treated water. There are some specific determinants. These are some specific determinants that we wanted to highlight based on the data submitted. And these can all be removed through treatment, but some are easier than others. So arsenic on the left there, this can be in source water, usually groundwater, due to natural geological features where there's volcanic activity, which is common in some areas of the country. Of the council supplies that had MAV exceedances, they have since installed treatment or are planning to install treatment for arsenic removal, which is a really good progress and good for all of the users of those supplies. Manganese in the middle there, this is commonly found alongside iron, which doesn't actually have a MAV, which is why it's not here. And it can cause significant aesthetic issues, which is where it's probably more commonly would have interacted with that. There were some exceedances of the MAV, but depending on the form it exists in, this is able to be treated and removed from the supply. And nitrate on the right there is a short-term MAV, unlike most of the drinking water standards, because it needs to it directly addresses the risk of blue baby syndrome, there were no MAV exceedances in the source samples submitted to us in this reporting, but there were some that were over 50% of the current MAV. So next up, we actually have question time. We've got our partai, so I'll hand it back to Noah, I think, or Richard.
Let me just introduce the question time process. I've been told it's important to read out the questions so that that's part of the recording. So you'll have to bear with me while I do that. And I'd also like to say, I was reflecting on this as we were doing the presentation, but the role of a regulator is only as good as those people who are being regulated. And by this, I mean, the questions that you ask and the probing that you do of what we've done is really important to up our game, which then in turn will help us up your game. So it's not a one-way street. We really value any input that you might have on the reports, what you would like to see in the reports, whether you see there's any problem with the reports, please let us know. It's well known that we are not an ancient organisation, an institution with a long history and pedigree. So, we've got room to learn. So please don't hold back. Okay, so first was a comment from Kaylee Simpson around Noah's comment around E. coli notifications, and she noted that England had 1,016 breaches in 2022, 35 of which were E. coli. And Noah's response was that what he'd been meaning was consumer advisories, that there were less than 10 consumer advisories as opposed to notifications.
Richard,
Kirsty, Yeah.
Could I just talk to
Yeah,
that
please.
one too? Yeah, apologies for that. And by consumer advisories, I actually mean boil water notices. So I should have compared that then, and I shouldn't have gone off script. But yeah, and I think 35 E. coli, it's still a significantly, exceptionally low percentage of E. coli samples out there. So be interesting to compare that to what our samples were. We just didn't have that high quality sample data that we needed to be able to do that comparison this year. Watch for that in future years, though.
Okay, and then we had a question from Kirsty McLeod. Level 3 annual rules. It looks like approximately 30% of the annual reportable rules were analysed for the report. Will councils be required to complete mandatory reporting on the complete set of rules again next year? And I think, Noah, you were going to answer that.
Yes, you will have to do that. The secondary legislation hasn't changed. It does require you to report on all of those rules. You might have a follow-up question, but pop it in the chat if you do. It's really important to note that these rules are really for you. And that's Jim coming back through me. But they are for you, and you need to know whether you comply. And the reporting of that, where it's just an assurance rule, the reporting is actually really easy to do. So I'd really encourage you to get those assurance rules reported on time. I understand there's quite a complexity behind some of the monitoring rules in level 3, and those need to be taken care of by yourselves to be able to report to us accurately with those. But I do acknowledge the significant amount of complexity that goes into reporting those monitoring rules.
Okay, and then we had a somewhat amusing exchange because Judy Williamson identified Little River as a real place with a T3 plant rather than a T2. And Noah pointed out that we just made that up in
That was a bad
Little River
example.
being a name, but we weren't intending to refer to the actual Little River. And then Kaylee Simpson noted at the end that England has had 470 events in 2022, 165 of those were significant and 11 serious. It would be good to be able to make meaningful comparisons in the future.
I would agree with that. And not all of those serious notifications were associated with bacterial. Some of them were lead and other things. So it would be good to compare us to England, Scotland. Not sure we're comparable to the US, but maybe Australia.
Those are all of the questions in the chat. I'm about to do a kind of a wedding thing and say if there aren't any further questions, we'll forever hold your peace. So please, if there's anything further you would like to say, please say it now in the chat. Okay, well, without further ado, here's one. Oh, there's two.
I know they all have more questions than that.
Okay, so here's one from Leonie. Will Tamata ROI be providing training workshops to identify cyanobacteria in waterways? I know the answer to this question. And the answer is that Water New Zealand and Tamata ROI will be doing a workshop on that very topic in late July. So watch either of our events pages for that. It is coming up. We've identified it as an important issue. Okay, anything further? Going once. Oh, here's another one. Thanks for your time. Okay, going twice. Gone. Have a good day. Enjoy the weekend. Hope it's sunny if that's what you need.